So for this set of questions, you need to remember the curves that we used, which were the savings, supply of savings curve, which would be this curve here, and the demand for investment purposes curve, which would be the downward sloping one. All of these questions more or less relate to this. So if the government of India made policy changes that increased national saving, which statement would best predict the consequences? Well, here they're not saying anything about investment. So if there's a policy that increases national saving, we would expect this savings curve, which is a mixture of national and public saving, of private and public saving, national saving, would shift right. And as this shifts right, the equilibrium interest rate in that country would be lower. If the equilibrium interest rate in that country is lower, less money will want to flow to that country and money will want to flow out. As that happens, the exchange rate of the rupee would depreciate. And we know that following a depreciation of a currency, their net exports would rise. In this figure here, if the world interest rate equals 4%, what is the net capital outflow? So typically in the upper section here, if we had a world interest rate which is greater than this small open economy's interest rate of 5%, anything that's above it leads to excess savings with respect to demand and leads to a surplus of money available. And that surplus of money available flows to other countries. So here we have, this is the level of saving, this is the level that's demanded by borrowers, so that excess amount is net capital outflow. And if we're below it, it's going to be net capital inflow, so net capital outflow is negative. If we have interest rate of 4, here we have the difference between 6 and 4, so we have 2,000. And here it's net capital inflow of 2,000 or negative net capital outflow of minus 2,000. If Canadian firms decide to invest more domestically at each interest rate, which statement would best describe the results? So if Canadian firms decide to invest more domestically at each interest rate, if we think about that graph with the demand for investment and the supply of savings, well, if we demand more domestically at each interest rate, it's the equivalent to saying that the demand curve for investment shifts right. What would happen in that case? Well, if we go back to the diagram we had below, the interest rate in that country would go up. As the interest rate in that country goes up, the exchange rate of that country would also appreciate. And as that happens, if we look on that graph, as you move to the right, that gap, if there was a gap, let's say the past interest rate, the world interest rate was higher, and there's a net capital outflow gap. Well, as our interest rate gets bigger, that net capital outflow will become smaller or it may become negative. So in Canadian, that capital outflow decreases. The People's Republic of China has had a large trade surplus in recent years. What is the most likely explanation of this surplus? So, if we're thinking about a surplus going on, let's try to look at each of them and see if it can make sense. China has a large amount of saving relative to domestic investment. So a large amount of saving, if that money cannot flow to other countries, well, will lead to an excess amount of savings, to net capital outflow if it could flow out. And if there's net capital outflow, we know that net capital outflow is the same as net exports. They have to be equal. So if net capital outflow is large and positive, that means that net exports must be also large and positive, which is a large trade surplus. Let's understand why the other answers are wrong. China has a high rate of inflation, which reduces the value of its currency. That's true that if you have a high rate of inflation, this could reduce the value of a currency, but this is not linked to a trade surplus, because as your goods become more expensive and your currency becomes cheaper, it kind of balances off. It doesn't make your goods more or less expensive to foreigners necessarily. China has a large supply of labor, so low wages give it a competitive edge. That's possible, but that's not linked to a trade surplus. You could be a country that has very low wages for workers, but you could still have negative net capital outflow and negative net exports. So the first one really confirms it, but the other ones are not necessarily quite true. Can be the case, but it doesn't have to. It doesn't lead to that situation for sure. China has made trade barriers which restrict the ability of other countries to sell their products in China. Even if that was the case, if you look at the impact of trade barriers on balance of trade in the chapter, you'll see that this will not occur for this reason. Which statement could be prompted by an interest rate that is temporarily higher in Canada than the rest of the world? So, a Swiss bank purchases a Canadian bond instead of the German bond and had considered purchasing can be true if all of a sudden there's an interest rate that is temporarily higher in Canada than elsewhere and it's just gone up. We've talked about the idea that money will flow to this country because of higher returns on some of the goods such as bonds, so money will be flowing in. Canadian net capital outflow would increase. Money flowing out from Canadians to elsewhere when we have higher interest rates does not make sense. It would be the opposite. Brad, a Canadian resident, decides to spend his savings on a trip to Hawaii. It's not really linked to an increase in our interest rate. If you have a loan and your interest rate may go up higher, you're not just going to decide to splurge. Canadian firms decide because interest rates are higher to do more investment spending. Actually, that's the opposite. We know that with higher interest rates, the demand for investment spending is lower. Hopefully this clarifies Chapter 13's practice questions.